Greetings everyone, Critters Pictures here, creator of The Hunters and the Hunted, and welcome to the behind the scenes for part 1. In this video, you'll experience all aspects of how the video came to be, including the story, the characters, set design, post-production, and more. For a quick rundown of the story, a group of highly specialized hunters, known as the Venator Unit, have located their wanted target, Zelkion, the Terminator Mind. However, it begins to act weird, and, well, you know the rest from there. This film was shot at 15 frames per second, a good balance between overall smooth animation, yet not taking overly long to animate. The biggest problem which occurs throughout most of the animation was this darn white screen. Most of the shots in this had a white screen, with only a couple that had blue screens. I tried many ways to remove it, but as I was pressed for time and I could not reshoot the entire thing, I decided to use the rotoscope tool in After Effects and go through every frame that had a white screen and remove that white background. It was an absolute nightmare. Load times became incredibly long, the cache had to be constantly cleaned out, and it just looked kind of horrible. As many of you know, that is why there are some parts of scenery or characters which appear or disappear from them. Lesson learned. Do not ever use a white screen. Ever again.
Move on.
The script was actually much longer than anticipated, and would have featured elements from part 2. This was even drawn up completely in the storyboards as well. However, due to time constraints, this was a school project after all, I had to cut off filming the rest of it and begin editing what I had. The components which were cut out, I set for the sequel. Although this was annoying for me initially, I was able to flesh it out immensely by adding in extra dialogue, scenes, and more action. With the script finished, I still needed a way to visualize how the animation would play out. So obviously, storyboards. Being much better than other storyboards I've done, I was able to have a good idea of how certain segments would play out. But since the storyboard didn't cover everything the script had, I had to come up with most shots on the spot. From this, I then divided the storyboard into 5 scenes. The film takes place on the forest planet Novus. Instead of Novus having normal forests, I acquired some magenta, purple, and lime colours and tried to mix the colours together, giving the place a more alien look, instead of a typical green forest. The opening shot was created from 2 separate compositions, one being the night sky, and the second being the hunters on the plateau. These were merged together, and the final additions were made, including the trees, the text, and the camera moving downwards between both shots. We are then shortly introduced to 2 members of the Venator Unit. I'll probably go into these characters more in depth in other videos, so I'll just give them the brief rundown just to let you know who they are. Maverick is the leader of the Venator Unit, and is the most experienced. His character was quite different than I originally imagined. Throughout the storyboards, I had him as a guardian from the Destiny universe. However, at the time, I had Titanfall 2 playing, and I was having great fun playing it. So I decided to change him to be an ex-pilot instead of a guardian. Kova was a monster hunter who was the second in command. His character was, and perhaps still is, the most difficult to portray his personality. In most situations, he didn't really have too many interactions with other characters, unless if it was about the plot. But the actor Andrew did a great job of putting out some expressions into him.
Hey, big medicine guy. It's about time you crawled yourself out of your hidey hole. We need to teach you some lessons on your manners.
The story immediately comes to a conflict, as Maverick uncovers something abnormal about their target, which is where Zelkion, the Terminator Mind, comes into play. The Vex Mind Zelkion is heavily based off a standard Minotaur design from the Destiny universe, with some slight additions. In terms of visual difference, really it was the greyish colour on the top half and the black on the bottom half, as well as its blade that can sheath for close quarters. Anyways, it was fun putting it together, trying to create something which had enough detail and showed enough resemblance to the designs in game, yet wasn't too big in size that it takes up like the entire frame. The binocular shot was one of the first and last shots to be worked on in post. The actual binocular interface was created through a series of shapes, which were masked, animated, and positioned to appear similar to the ones shown through Star Wars. but also different at the same time. The other layers, such as the text and the blue grid, were made afterwards, and I then made the inside of the binoculars transparent, so footage can be shown through behind. The footage of Zelkion attacking the bandits took quite a bit of time to edit, due to the amount that was edited and figuring out how to have Zelkion teleport near the end. Despite taking some time, I had fun with some of the different moments that occurred. I finally keyframed the scale and position, and also added a wiggle expression to the footage to create that handheld look that I was after, which turned out much better than I thought it would. Shortly after, we are then introduced to Holder. She's a light mage, and is talented in the light, able to use it to both support her allies and deal damage to her opponents. As Kova grabs the others for attention, we are then introduced to the rest of the unit. First, we have Tolvar. Tolvar is the cockiest out of the lot. He's the one who always wants to fight the enemy head on, and at times, disobeys orders quite frequently. Funny enough, happens later on. Next we get to Amzi. Amzi was a mercenary, excellent at sharpshooting, piloting ships, and very proficient with her weapons. During the early days of scripting the story, Amzi was meant to be a male character. When it came to finding voice actors, I couldn't find anyone to voice the character, until I got asked by Chloe, who was the original voice actor for her, if there were any spots left, so I changed the character to be female and gave her the role, who was then later recasted due to the pandemic, which also took a while. She's also quite cocky, but not to an extent Tolvar was. And finally, we have the latest recruit, Dawson. Dawson was an ODST who, in contrast to the rest of the hunters, is quite inexperienced. I also wanted to have the characters have their own personality. You can mostly see this between Amzi and Dawson. They like to tease each other about who has the better shot, as they're both sharpshooters.
Why am I always with the rookie?
Is it because I'm a better sniper than you are?
Oh well, you wanna bet that?
With their plan now set in motion, they prepared to ambush Zelkion. Scene 2, in my opinion, was probably the longest and hardest scene to complete, for both animating and in visual effects. Many new effects were made within this scene, some of which required more experimenting and testing than others. Firstly came designing some spells for Holder. The primary spell I came up with was some ball of light that can either be a conduit of sorts, or can be casted itself towards enemies. Kind of like the candlelight spell and the sunlight spells in Skyrim. The spell itself was made up of several layers of fractal noise, overlaid together, which was shaped as a sphere. Each layer was then given varying rotation speeds, to make it look as if the light was just moving across the route. I also added an outline animation to the ball of light, giving the feeling of it materializing into reality. Next was a beam of light that can be focused onto one point. This was going on what I mentioned prior. The balls of light act as a conduit of sorts, which allowed the light to be casted. For the spells to visually look consistent, I used the same noise textures from my prior spell, on both the light beam and wall shield. With the light beam spell, I applied the Saber plugin from Video Copilot onto a pre-composed layer of my noise textures. I then changed the colour, animated it, and also distorted the core to make it look more unstable, instead of just a laser beam. To make it look as if it was actually impacting the target, I put in some muzzle flashes, which rotated as the spell hit the target. And finally, there was the wall spell, or shield. This one was made in a similar fashion to the balls of light. I also added a border and a ring of spikes to make it look a bit interesting. Little did I know though that the noisy layout looks a bit too fuzzy, but maybe that's just me. Animating the ambush sequence proved a bit more difficult than expected. This was probably the point I started to realise Zelkion's model was going to prove annoying to animate. Not only was its bulky size meant that it kept tipping, but its fragile structure made it constantly fall apart. Eventually I found a solution by using a combination of blue tack and coloured bricks to make Zelkion look as if it was being sent. A clean plate was shot and the bricks and blue tack were masked out in post. Even with Tolvar getting the jump though, he was still bested quite easily. This shot could have been done better. It looks as if Zelkion held the tree in its hand the entire time, and the tree leaves suddenly disappear from thin air, but the teleport effect manages to make it look a little bit cleaner. I masked Zelkion at the point where I wanted it to disappear and reappear, and added some fractal noise to it, which was set to blocky type, altered the colours with some tint, and animated it growing out. And then came the fight sequence. This was fun animating everyone simultaneously. I tried to make the hunters' movements and actions correlate to their characters. Maverick, for instance, slides under Zelkion and goes to shoot at it from the back, showing how he's more tactical than the others. Even with all of that, Zelkion just had to ruin the fun, didn't it? Even with its basic movement, its body was still too fragile. I suppose that's why the fight sequence feels a bit underwhelming, since the hunters are pretty much shooting at a still target. This was also the reason why Zelkion was still for most of the binocular shot prior. Hopefully the Vex barrier made it a bit more interesting. This design was based off this big Vex boy, Argos. The barrier was made using multiple rectangles and squares of varying sizes, which moved upwards. Next was some color gradients to fill up the empty blackness, as well as some glow and tint. I then added some edges to make it more three-dimensional, and finally duplicated it multiple times for the shots it was used for. Out of the entire animation, this barrier was probably the best effect I've created yet. Little did I know that there were actually Vex barriers in Destiny 2, on 2 locations, well technically 3, that actually have contained enemies inside of them. Would have made my life a bit easier. After a period of fighting Zelkion, it suddenly disappears into nothingness. After Zelkion disappears, the hunters regroup to discuss what just happened, and lose communications with Udo. Many audio layers were piled together to create that static-like sound over comms, and helped for making that abrupt disruption in communications. Whilst the hunters were discussing about the prior event, and Tolvar continuing to lose his faith over Udo, Amzi uncovers the broken blade of Zelkion. You can actually see this blade just as Zelkion is being ripped away, but it's quite hard to notice as it gets launched pretty quickly. With more confusion stirring about, the hunters are then startled by the orb. The orb is actually a really peculiar character. It warns Dawson of what's coming, but at the same time, nestles him with all these kinds of riddles, which eventually annoys Dawson. The orb did have a bit of a rewrite to it, which kinda makes the scene quite confusing. Initially, it was some random orb that drew weak-minded people in hopes of baiting them into a trap. I later discovered that it talks, so I then had to add a conversation between the two. What probably came most confusing was who the orb was actually talking to. For most of the conversation, only Dawson can hear it, but right after he gets mad, it then talks to everyone else but Dawson. I thought by having a shallow depth of field on Dawson and a wider focus on the orb, it would make it seem as if he was the only one who was hearing it. Another challenging thing about it was also manipulating the sound. Since I haven't played around with sound too much at the time, I had to mimic the voice to be as accurate as possible. Although it not only sounded quite different, but the effects I added impacted the volume of the dialogue, so at points you can barely even hear it. Fortunately enough, the creation of the orb was quite straightforward, and turned out much better than the audio. I made a lot of these white streak shapes, which were then duplicated multiple times, rotated and contained a wiggle expression so it looked a little bit more alive. This also helped save lots of time, as I didn't have to hand animate it unlike other elements of the film. Then there was a black sphere and a couple of masked white circles which had a glow effect. When putting it into the comp, I then added final expression, so as it moves around, it bobs whilst it does it. Looking back however, this scene should have been reshot entirely, to make it a bit more interesting, and also to make much more sense. But hey, we all have to start from somewhere, right? After it disappears, the hunters plan out their next move, until something unexpected happens. The hunters are then suddenly surrounded by a mysterious foe. This was one of the only instances in which I moved the camera physically. Other when Maverick gets annoyed at Amzi, I was really hesitant to do so, as carpet plus a fold up table don't go too well. But in the end, it was key to portray the arrival of a new and mysterious foe, as well as get a sense of scale. I situated the camera and tripod onto a wooden board that I could just move every shot I'd take to make it move. The board also helped me reduce much of the camera shake, which definitely helped out, particularly with the longer shots. Shortly after, however, the hunters uncover a newly transformed Zelkion, but that will be explained in another video. In my opinion, it was an overall good starting film, having some smooth animation, decent visual effects, yet also containing many issues. These problems are going to be addressed for part 2, and hopefully will be remedied. If you have further questions about this short film, or wanted to provide some feedback for me to improve future videos, feel free to post a comment. Anyways, that is it for me today. Hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next video.